Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're exploring history, but not in the way you might expect. We're going to look at it through a Daoist lens, specifically how this ancient philosophy can help us understand the complex and often unpredictable forces that shape the world around us, ready to challenge some assumptions about how history works.
Absolutely. Western thought often emphasizes a linear view of history, this idea of constant progress towards a predetermined goal. But Taoism offers a different perspective, one that emphasizes cycles and the interplay of opposing forces. Not a simple pendulum swing, but something far more dynamic and, dare I say, a bit more chaotic.
Okay, so let's dive into our source material. An essay from Noema Magazine titled The Modern Wisdom of Daoist History. The author, a sociology professor, was researching democracy's rise and fall when they started questioning those linear narratives we often take for granted. What's interesting is they realized how efforts to promote democracy sometimes led to unexpected and even undesirable outcomes.
It's a great example of how actions can generate unintended consequences, a key theme in Taoist thought. The essay highlights how those symmetrical cycles, the kind we see in the works of Spengler or Turchin, aren't the whole story. Taoism suggests history is shaped by asymmetrical cycles, meaning the forces driving change are constantly evolving and interacting in unpredictable ways.
So it's not just a simple back and forth, like a pendulum.
Exactly. The essay calls this the principle of reverse movement. As something rises, the forces opposing it also grow. Think of it like a cosmic tug of war, where each force generates its opposite.
That's a really compelling image, but what does that actually look like in practice? Can you give us a concrete example?
Certainly. Let's take military competition. Initial success often breeds overconfidence, leading to overexpansion, underestimation of rivals, and even overlooking internal weaknesses.
Ah, so you're saying success itself can be a trap, almost like a seed of its own potential downfall. History is full of empires that crumbled because they got a little too comfortable at the top, right?
Precisely. And this applies not just to empires, but to companies, political movements, even personal goals. That initial victory can make us a bit blind to the shifting tides.
So how can we avoid falling into that trap? How do we become more aware of these opposing forces before they knock us off balance?
That's where the Taoist concept of wu-wei comes in. It's often translated as non-action. But it's not about being passive. It's more about understanding the natural flow of events and acting in harmony with it, rather than trying to force things in a particular direction.
So it's like recognizing that you can't control the river, but you can learn to navigate its currents.
Exactly. Wu-wei is about cultivating a sense of humility, recognizing that our actions have ripple effects we may not always foresee. It's about being adaptable, observant, and willing to adjust our course as needed.
This is making me think about all those predictions we hear about the future, whether it's technology or politics. It seems like we're constantly trying to force the world into a neat and tidy narrative, when in reality, it's far more messy and unpredictable.
That's a great observation. The Taoist perspective reminds us that those linear predictions often miss the mark because they fail to account for the complexity of these opposing forces.
So how do we start to see the world through this Taoist lens? What are some key takeaways we can apply to our own lives and observations?
The essay highlights three key points. First, there's no single force driving history towards a predetermined end. So be wary of those grand narratives that suggest there's one right path to progress.
Okay, so no more end of history talk. Things are a bit more nuanced than that.
Exactly. Second, power comes with a responsibility to understand the potential consequences, intended or not, that your actions might generate.
It's like that old saying, be careful what you wish for.
Precisely. And finally, avoid linear predictions. The future is shaped by a complex interplay of forces, and it's better to embrace that complexity than try to squeeze it into a neat little box.
So, ditch the crystal ball and embrace the messiness. I can get behind that, but seriously, what's the danger of clinging too tightly to that linear view of history? What happens when we oversimplify things?
The essay argues it can lead to a dangerous sense of moral superiority. Believing you're on the right side of history can justify all sorts of harmful actions.
Oof, I see what you mean. History is full of examples of that kind of thinking leading to conflict and oppression.
And it's important to remember, even those symmetrical cycle theories, while helpful in challenging linear narratives, have their limitations. They can be too rigid, too focused on predictable patterns, and they often underestimate the role of individual actions and those unexpected events that throw everything off course.
So where does that leave us? How do we make sense of the world if we can't rely on those neat and tidy narratives?
Well, the Taoist perspective encourages us to embrace a more nuanced and holistic view. It's about recognizing that every force, every action, generates its opposite, and that understanding this principle can help us navigate the complexities of life with a bit more wisdom and a lot less hubris.
Welcome back. Last time we were talking about how even achieving a goal can set in motion the forces that could lead to failure. I have to admit, that's kind of a mind-bending concept.
It definitely challenges our usual way of thinking. We tend to assume that success leads to more success, but the Taoist perspective reminds us that it's often a catalyst for its opposite.
You mentioned that this linear way of thinking can pop up in all sorts of unexpected places. Got any examples that might really illustrate this?
Well, the essay mentions radical veganism. It's a movement often associated with progressive values. But even some proponents can exhibit linear thinking. There are instances where they go as far as comparing eating meat to the Holocaust.
Wow, that's a pretty extreme comparison. It sounds like they're putting their dietary choices on a moral pedestal and assuming their view represents the inevitable direction of history. It's sort of, we're right, you're wrong, the future's vegan kind of thinking.
Exactly. It highlights how even groups with good intentions can fall into the trap of linear thinking. They may even feel justified in taking extreme actions based on that perceived moral high ground.
It's a good reminder that we all need to be aware of our own biases, no matter what our beliefs are.
Absolutely. And the Taoist perspective encourages us to see the world in shades of gray, acknowledging the interplay of opposing forces and accepting that outcomes can often be unexpected.
So how does this Taoist wisdom help us make sense of all the complex challenges we face today? Things like political polarization, climate change, constant technological disruption. The list seems endless.
Well, it emphasizes that there are no easy solutions, no quick fixes for complex problems.
So are you saying that trying to force things in one direction will likely cause unintended consequences? Almost like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back scenario?
Precisely. The Taoist perspective encourages us to embrace complexity, look for the underlying patterns and connections, and consider different viewpoints before taking action.
It's kind of like if you're not aware of the complexity of the problem, your solution might just make things worse.
Exactly. The Taoist view emphasizes humility and adaptability. It's about understanding that our actions have ripple effects and that we need to be flexible enough to adjust course as the situation changes.
This is all making a lot of sense, but how do we balance this Taoist perspective with the need to actually take action? Isn't there a risk of overthinking things and ending up paralyzed by all that complexity?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that Wu Wei, that Taoist principle of non-action, is not about passivity or inaction. It's about acting in alignment with the natural flow of events rather than trying to impose our will on them.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between putting in the effort and also accepting that there are things we simply can't control.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that while we can't control everything, we can influence outcomes by understanding the dynamics at play.
It's like being a surfer. You can't control the ocean, but you can learn to read the waves and adjust your movements to harness their power.
That's a fantastic analogy. It highlights the importance of observation, intuition, and timing in navigating complex situations.
So are there any areas where you think this Taoist perspective might be particularly useful?
Well, the essay specifically mentions international relations. The author suggests that American foreign policy often operates on a very linear view of history.
You mean that whole idea that we can spread democracy around the world and create a more peaceful and prosperous future for everyone?
Exactly. And while those are certainly worthy goals, the Taoist perspective would caution us about assuming our actions will always have the intended results.
Right. History shows that sometimes those well-intentioned interventions can backfire pretty spectacularly.
Exactly. The Taoist perspective would suggest we need to be more aware of the unique cultural and political landscapes of other nations and understand that our interventions may trigger unintended consequences, potentially even increasing instability.
This reminds me of how the U.S. tried to promote democracy in Afghanistan and Iraq, the idea being that removing dictators and holding elections would automatically lead to stable and flourishing democracies. And, well, that didn't exactly go to plan.
Right, and situations like those highlight the flaws in a purely linear view of history. It's simply not as easy as exporting a political system and assuming it will flourish in a different cultural context.
The Taoist perspective would suggest that we need to be more sensitive to those underlying social, economic, and political realities.
Exactly. It urges a more holistic understanding of the interconnectedness of events and encourages us to be prepared for outcomes we didn't anticipate.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. I'm finding that this Taoist lens is giving me a whole new way of looking at the world.
It certainly offers a shift in perspective, and I think it can be incredibly valuable in helping us navigate the complexities of the 21st century.
This has been such a fascinating discussion. We've covered so much ground already. But there's still more to explore. Coming up after the break, we'll look at more concrete examples of how we can apply this Taoist wisdom to our own lives and the world around us. Stay with us.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Taoist history. It's amazing how this ancient philosophy offers such relevant insights for navigating our modern world. It really speaks to the timelessness of those core Taoist principles, embracing change, understanding the interconnectedness of things, and recognizing that every force generates its opposite.
Earlier, we discussed how even well-intentioned actions can have unexpected consequences. It makes you wonder, are there any seemingly positive trends happening right now that might be setting the stage for their own reversal?
It's certainly something to consider. The essay gives the example of Ezra Vogel's book, Japan is Number One. He analyzed Japan's economic success after World War II, pointing to factors like job security, generous pensions, and an efficient bureaucracy. All those things seem positive on the surface.
Right. Absolutely. Those sound like solid foundations for a thriving economy.
They were for a time, but those same factors eventually contributed to Japan's economic stagnation just a few years later. Those systems designed to promote stability ended up creating rigidity.
So the very things that fueled Japan's rise also sowed the seeds of its slowdown. That's a perfect example of the principle of reverse movement in action.
It really highlights how easy it is to misinterpret the present when we're stuck in a linear mindset, assuming that what worked in the past will continue to work forever.
So are you saying we're constantly misreading the signs because we're so used to thinking in a straight line?
It's certainly a possibility. The essay argues that this linear bias isn't just a Western thing. It's influencing modern China as well, which has, in many ways, moved away from its own traditional cyclical understanding of history.
So what can we do about it? How can we start to see the world through this more nuanced Taoist lens? Especially if those linear biases are so deeply ingrained.
Well, for one, we could try to become more aware of the potential downsides of success in our own lives. Think about it. When you achieve a goal, do you ever find yourself getting a bit complacent, maybe a little overconfident?
Oh, absolutely. I've definitely fallen into that trap before. You start thinking you've got it all figured out, and then bam, something unexpected happens.
The Taoist perspective reminds us to stay vigilant, even when things are going well. It encourages us to cultivate humility, knowing that success can be fleeting and that setbacks are inevitable.
It's about acknowledging that the only constant is change, right? We need to be adaptable and ready to pivot.
Exactly. And it's not just about personal growth. We can apply this to broader societal trends, too. Think about the rise of social media. It's been hailed as a democratizing force, connecting people around the world. But are there potential downsides to that connectivity?
Oh, definitely. It can also be a breeding ground for misinformation, polarization, echo chambers. It's almost like a digital Tower of Babel sometimes.
And that's what the Taoist perspective encourages us to do, to see both the good and the bad, to consider those unintended consequences. It's not about rejecting progress, but about approaching it with a balanced and informed perspective.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new set of mental tools for understanding the world. And myself a bit better.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, the Taoist perspective isn't about providing all the answers. It's about asking the right questions, challenging our assumptions, and embracing complexity.
It's about recognizing those cyclical patterns in our own lives and in the world around us, understanding that every force, every action generates its opposite.
Exactly. And if we can grasp that fundamental principle, I think we can navigate the ebb and flow of life with a bit more wisdom, a bit more grace, and a lot less fear.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been a truly enlightening conversation.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring the Taoist perspective. It offers the timeless wisdom that can be incredibly relevant for navigating the complexities of our modern world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.